Well, good morning. It is so good to see you. I know we have several of our members who are away. This seems to be a travel season as the colors continue to change on the trees. And many are camping this week and some are visiting family. But we also have several visitors here with us this morning. I have some of my students here this morning. And I have a special group of students that are actually called my advisory group. Coach Becky Starks and I share 10 students that we meet 4 times a week with. That is really just a connection and a special fun. We actually won the challenge of all the advisory groups, and we got to go to Topgolf as a group. These 10 students and I and Coach Becky Starks, 3 of the 10 are here today, here in the front. I hope you'll get to meet them at the end of the service and tell them how glad you are that they're here. I guess the best way to start this is to say, y'all ain't gonna believe this. Yesterday, as I was preparing and putting on the finishing touches for what I would like to say today, as a matter of fact, I even turned down tickets to go to a particular team that I really love to watch play from Mike Cochran yesterday. I said, Mike, I really can't. I've got to finish. And I was reading some, and I was going through some of the things I wanted to say, and the sunshine was coming through the windows there in my office. And you ever, as you're reading and the sun hits you, and you get a little maybe fatigued. You maybe get a little tired. Your eyes get a little tired. And so I said to myself, I think I need to get something that will give me a little pep. Give me through that moment. And I decided, what would be great is maybe a couple scoops of ice cream. Have you ever been there? And so I go into the kitchen, and I opened the freezer door, and there it was right there in the door, and I pulled it out, and I got a bowl down, and I went to the cupboard or the cabinet, and I pulled out an old ice cream scoop. It has a yellow handle, and it's gray, and the gray's kind of speckled. It doesn't have one of those things that you can release. It just is a scoop. And I thought this would be my perfect weapon of choice. And so I started digging into the ice cream to make the perfect round circle for a scoop. The first one come out perfect. Put it in the bowl. I decided to go to the second one, and I continued to work a little bit, and finally I got the perfect scoop to think, I have the 2 most perfect scoops of ice cream that I could have. This will be just the ticket for this afternoon. So I put the scoop of ice cream in the bowl, and when I did, I noticed on the side of the ice cream scoop, there was some ice cream that was hanging off, about to drip. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't like to clean up sticky. I didn't want it to drip on the countertop, and I sure didn't want to lose that great ice cream. And so I decided, as my hand was holding the bowl, my other hand was holding the ice cream scoop, to put the scoop to my mouth. Well, I didn't know that when this particular metal gets cold and it touches something that is maybe a little wet, that it sticks. And the next thing, I wish I were making this up. The next thing I noticed is that the ice cream scoop is stuck to my lip, and I can't get it to come off. And I had both hands out like this going, what do I do? And an ice cream scoop sticking out of my mouth. I thought about that little boy in the Christmas story who I thought surely no one would be dumb enough to stick their tongue to a flagpole in the middle of the winter. There's someone today going, surely no one's dumb enough to stick their mouth to an ice cream scoop that's just been working to create 2 perfect scoops of ice cream. Well, there comes a time and moment when you just have to deal with it. And so I decided, Scott, it's time to man up. You take a couple of good deep breaths, and I pull the ice cream scoop off of my mouth. You know what happened? my mouth started to bleed. And then all of a sudden, I've got a paper towel on my lip, and I'm struggling with the idea, how do I have a paper towel on my lip and eat my ice cream? You know, sometimes sacrifices just have to be made. And so I decided to ditch the paper towel and just dive into the ice cream. And we're here today, and I hope that you will be patient with me. If you hear any slur in my speech, hopefully it won't begin to bleed again. Have you ever thought about holiday traditions? Maybe some of you like that Christmas Story. Maybe some of you have movies that you have in mind, or maybe some of you have certain days that you do things with family. I love this time of year as we're starting to get into those holiday traditions. Growing up, we had a holiday tradition that was, I think, not that unique from everybody else. My grandmother used to put a puzzle out on the table. And she would just leave it there for a couple of months. And if you came by, you could work and put a piece in it, or you might even want to sit down for a little while and work it together. Did anybody else do that or have that done, or even choose to do that today? That puzzle. Well, as we begin the second part of how God pursues his children, I hope you see how we're putting the pieces of the puzzle together. I hope you notice how God continues to work as he pursues his children diligently. I hope you see how God's promises, these covenant promises, were efforts for him to have a deep, intimate relationship with his children that all parents desire. I hope that you see they were specific in nature, but yet they bring messages and lessons that all of us can take with us every day. I hope you remember when we looked at Adam and Eve. I hope you think about the way that they gave up the eternal life in the garden and walking with God each day in the cool of the day there in the garden. I hope you realize that the lessons that we can learn today are to trust in God's warnings, and that God never warns us just to stop us from any enjoyment, but truly for protection. And as we looked at Noah, I hope you learned that if we don't conform to society, if we don't buy into what society says all around us, that God will protect us from any rising waters that may occur. I hope you looked at the promises and the covenants as we looked at Abraham's promise and covenant that God made with him, where he says you'll have more descendants than stars in the heaven or grains of sand on the seashore. But isn't God's timing funny? And I hope you realize to trust in God's timing, that it doesn't come sometimes exactly when we want it, but God is faithful. God is faithful to his promises and his covenants, and his promises, they'll always come to fruition. He'll never leave us wondering. All of these covenant promises fit together like grandma's puzzle. It's that one that hopefully is welcoming you in to sit down and pick up a piece, to look at the box, to see the plan of the one that created it in the first place, and start fitting it together and enjoying the experience as we see God's purpose, his plan, his pursuit unfold. This morning, I want us to look at God's plan as it continues. And after we leave Abraham, we see that the Israelites, or Abraham's descendants, go into Exodus, and you know the story of Joseph well. We know that Abraham's descendants multiplied rapidly. As a matter of fact, some scholars have estimated that there could have been 4 million Israelites that were there in Egyptian captivity. But then you look at Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 8, and it says, "Then a new king, whom Joseph meant nothing, came into power in Egypt. Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, and they will even become more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. This new Pharaoh that didn't realize what God's servant Joseph had done for their entire country, who had saved them from famine, who had become second in command to lead their nation. This new Pharaoh that believed that he was a God that was to be worshiped, that enslaved God's people. This new Pharaoh that didn't believe in Jehovah God, but his people cried out. God's people cried out, and God heard their voices, and God sends Moses. God sends Moses to be his instrument of divine power, to lead the people out of Egypt towards the land that God had promised Abraham with his covenant earlier. After escaping Pharaoh, and that's a mouthful with just 3 words, the people reached the foothills of Mount Sinai, where God shows up to revisit the covenant. The covenant promises that he made with Abraham, and acting as a representative for Israel, Moses ascends to the top of the mountain. He ascends there to hear the terms of the covenant, the things that God requires from his people. And God promises to make Israel a holy nation. God instructs Israel to obey the laws given at Mount Sinai. He promises to bless them if they'll do so. But he also gives the warning that if you break my covenant and my laws, there will be curses. Look there in Deuteronomy chapter 28 that was read this morning, starting in verse 1. I think James read that at the beginning of our service this morning. "If you fully obey the Lord, your God, and you carefully follow his commandments I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God." But if you skip down a few verses to verse 15, there comes the warning as well, as he says, "However, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow his commandments and decrees that I give you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you." You see, Israel's alliance to God was supposed to be an outward reflection in the way they live. You were supposed to be able to tell by the way someone lives that you're God's child. It was supposed to come out in the way that they walk. It was supposed to come out in the way that they talk. You were supposed to tell who your father was by the things that you did and the things that you cared about. Well, as we see the story continue, God's people enter Canaan, this promised land, but eventually they demanded a human king. They demanded a human king so that they would look like the other nations that surrounded them. They wanted to look like these other nations, to have a warrior king that they could put their trust in, not knowing that the whole time that they had a king that was more powerful than any king would ever be or has ever been. In that verse there in 1 Samuel, where Samuel is so disheartened because they're about to anoint a new human king, and God says, Samuel, why are you so sad? It's not you that they have rejected, but it is me that they've rejected as their king. And so Saul was anointed as the first human king of Israel. But he fails. He fails by disobeying God, and he's rejected. So God chooses David as the new king to come and rule over Israel. And David becomes a successful leader. He restores order back to Israel. He becomes maybe the greatest warrior to ever live. And God responds by making a covenant with David. He promises to make David's name great. We still talk about it today. And more importantly, he promises to raise up a descendant from his line whose throne and kingdom will last forever. David and his descendants must continue to be faithful to God, following this covenant that God makes with them. And however, and despite that David and his sons have failures, God keeps his promises to provide a faithful descendant of David to reign. All these covenant promises continue to place puzzle pieces together, filling in the picture of God's complete plan. After we see the covenant with David, we see the outside border of the puzzle has been filled in. Isn't that what you go for first? But we're still waiting for the center. The corner pieces are the easiest, aren't they? But we're still waiting for the center of the puzzle to be completed, and ultimately, the puzzle will reveal the great deliverer, the Messiah from the line of David, who will make right the fractured relationship that began way back in the garden, as we talked about last week. For generations, God's children ignored the terms of the covenant offered by our Savior and our Father. As they broke his commandments, they began to live their own definition of what is good and what is evil. In his constant pursuit for his children, God offers a new covenant that will be everlasting. You see, we weren't able to keep our side of the contract. So we had to have someone come in for us. We had to have a new agent. And Jesus stepped forward. Jesus says, I'll negotiate on your behalf. And so he goes into the throne room of God and he speaks to God and he says, God, we need to talk about the contract and we want something new. And God asked Jesus, what are you willing to offer? What are you willing to offer for their lack of abiding by the terms? What are you willing to offer as a sign of commitment for the new covenant? Because there's a price that has to be paid. You know. Jesus says, I'll offer my blood. I'll become the sacrifice that's required for the covenant to not be broken. Let my blood pay for the sins of humanity. Let me serve as both priest and king. Let me be the everlasting bridge between God and his children. Let me be the one that completes the puzzle. I hope you've noticed that the covenant promises progressively build upon each other, one after another, to complete the storyline and show God's constant pursuit of his children. This redemptive storyline as God has always planned. We see that God created Adam and Eve, and he created intimacy that he desires from his children. That God preserved the world through Noah. He initiated redemption through Abraham. He established the nation of Israel through Moses. He promised an eternal shepherd king through the line of David. And then the fulfillment of all his covenants through Jesus. He is the fulfillment. And that's why in Hebrews 9, verse 15, it says, for this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. God always keeps his promises. And his promise to you is this, that you too can live through eternity with him. I hope you see that God has always been in pursuit of his children. And you sitting in the pews today are just that, his children. If you have been the one to run, it's time to come home. If you have not made the commitment yet, it's time to commit. God is waiting at the door, and he's looking at the skyline and the horizon, waiting for you to come over the crest so that he can run to you. Are you willing? If we can help you this morning, why don't you come while we stand and sing?
When we